Okay, wait. I know that's a pretty ballsy title, right? So let me just start by saying that I loved Spider-Verse, okay? This video is not like a hit piece on Spider-Verse. I grew up as a huge fan of both the Ninja Turtles and Spider-Man. In fact, my obsession with Spider-Man has more than continued into my adult years, so this isn't some bias or attack on the series. This is just one band's opinion on an animated film about mutant Ninja Turtles. Another one about superpowered spider people, and why I think of the two this summer, the Ninja Turtles stole my heart just a little more. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, if you weren't aware, is the latest film adaptation of the hit series that has continued to amuse kids just like I used to be for many, many years now. And just like both the original TMNT run and a lot of the adaptations since took a lot of inspiration from popular superhero comics at the time, Mutant Mayhem definitely takes heavy inspiration from Into the Spider-Verse, the phenomenal animated movie from 2018, I'm sure most of you all know and love dearly. Spider-Verse was a noteworthy milestone in superhero movies because in the age of the MCU and the DCU, it was an animated standalone movie that would see a theatrical release and with a pretty decent budget as well. It was also a pretty big deal for animated movies. It was one of the first notable films to break off from the Pixar style that every other animated movie was following at the time. And DreamWorks started to follow suit with more stylized animation like The Bad Guys and Puss in Boots. And now Nickelodeon are getting in on that action with Mutant Mayhem, another attempt at telling the origin story of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with incredibly stylized animation. It's not dissimilar to Spider-Verse, but it is certainly unique. It has a much more rough and sketched out aesthetic. It looks rudimentary in a very deliberate and charming sense as opposed to Spider-Verse, which even across its multitude of fantastic styles, tended to look pretty polished. And the animation is, of course, one of the film's highlights, just as it was in both Spider-Verse movies. And this is where personal priorities come into things. See, for me, visuals are an undoubtedly essential and key part of a movie experience, right? I mean, the whole medium is visual. How good your movie looks is such an important factor, but there's something that matters just a little more to me personally, and that's your story. Not just how engaging it is, but how concisely you can tell it, how well you convey your themes, and also how consistent those themes are. And this was honestly an area that I do think TMNT excelled in just a little more than Spider-Verse. Across the Spider-Verse was still a fantastic time, and the story mostly lands, but in my opinion was a little messy for a few reasons. I don't know if it was down to the writers or the producers or whatever, but I think the decision to split across the Spider-Verse into two parts was very risky, and it just didn't really land for me. Two-parters in films are always a big risk because you have to balance out an exciting cliffhanger with a satisfying conclusion in order to make sure that the audience leaves the theatre happy with what they saw, but also hungry for more. And to give the MCU some credit, they handled this really well with Infinity War. Infinity War makes the really smart choice of having their villain play something of a protagonist role. Thanos' quest for the stones is ultimately the journey that you as an audience follow in this film, and he has more screen time than anyone else. This is really clever because it has this effect where even though the villain wins and we're left with a big unhappy ending, uncertain about where the heroes go from here, our brains get the satisfaction of having seen a goal carried out from start to finish. Thanos got his conclusion. The character we spent the most time with achieved what he set out to do, and so you tend to feel satisfied by the end of that plotline. But you're still hungry for more of the hero's plotline, and Endgame is very much a conclusion to their story. Spider-Verse for me, unfortunately, handled two-parters in probably the worst way it could have. It didn't really feel like part one had its own conclusion. Instead, we're introduced to a villain who completely disappears from the film before Spider-Man even meets the rest of the Spider Society, and it then pivots into treating 2099 as the bad guy instead. We're treated to this visually fantastic sequence where Spider-Man fights off the rest of Spider Society before returning to his own reality, or so he thinks, because he later finds out this isn't his world, but instead the one that the spider that bit him came from, and is confronted by a version of himself that became the Prowler. The film then rather abruptly cuts to be continued, and that's kind of it, see you in a year. And the issue with this is that we get this really awesome climax in the form of the chase through 2099, but then the film just like carries on for another 20 minutes or so before ending on a scene that feels more like the end of an episode to a TV show, not an entire film. Something you'd be okay with waiting a week to find out the next step in, but not necessarily a year, even longer than that now because of delays.
No! No! No!
There's really no resolution to neither Spider-Man or the villain's plotlines in this film. One villain disappears, and the other is still just kind of looking for Spider-Man. And then Spider-Man himself is being held hostage by yet another villain that they've just introduced. And to his credit, they do wrap up Gwen's plotline, and they do so beautifully, but she's very much the sidekick in this movie, and her plotline can be more or less reduced to 2 or 3 scenes anyway. I think for the two-parter to have been more effective, the villain have to have his conclusion in part 1, then the hero in part 2. The Spider-Verse for me feels more like they wrote a 5-hour movie and then just cut it straight down the middle. And this is something that TMNT obviously didn't have to deal with. It's a standalone movie, there's definitely sequel potential and even a few teases to suggest that that's already the plan, but it's just a single story, right? And this of course means that there is, in my opinion, a satisfying and honestly really unexpected conclusion. For those of you who don't know, this film focuses really hard on the desire to fit in, especially as a teenager, and it's really different from anything else I've seen for TMNT adaptations.
Break! That guy's the goat of all time.
The film actually does result in humans becoming accepting of mutant kind, which is super unexpected, but it created for this really heartwarming and uplifting ending, actually, which, as a long-time Turtle fan, was kind of a relief. To stay on theme with the comparison here, the Spider-Man fans are currently begging for the comic team to just let Peter Parker grow up and be happy, rather than keeping him stuck in this constant state of teenage-like behavior that he has now in the comics. And honestly, for a long time, watching the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has felt pretty sad. Like, no matter how many times I watch these dudes, they end up shunned by humanity, and seeing a version of them where they finally get the happy ending they want was not only a really nice conclusion to the film, but it was a really great moment for the franchise as a whole, in my opinion. But hey, I hear you, maybe this isn't a totally fair comparison. Like I mentioned, TMNT isn't a two-parter, it didn't have to deal with this problem, so we'll move on to something else, the themes that are at play. Across the Spider-Verse, at least in my opinion, is a little unclear about what it's trying to say. I think Gwen's story is actually the strongest part of this film, and not only does it feel like it concludes, but there's a pretty consistent theme for me. Her story, in my eyes at least, felt like an allegory for the struggles a lot of transgender people will go through when coming out to their parents in particular. Spider-Man's journey is a little less clear though. Like, he is struggling to balance life and being Spider-Man, as some version of the character always is, but that was kind of it. Like, Into the Spider-Verse had this fantastic cohesive narrative about trusting in yourself and being your own person, not trying to live in someone else's shadow because you're enough as you are, and it's all beautifully summed up by the leap of faith scene and the iconic line, "Anyone can wear the mask," that gets repeated throughout the film. It's really hammered into you and it drives home what the film is trying to say.
Anyone can wear the mask. You could wear the mask.
Across the Spider-Verse didn't ever really reach this point for me. And that's not to say there's no arc or no development, because there is. Miles' parents are doubting him a lot at the start of the film, and Spider Society act as though he isn't capable of being part of their team. So there is this theme of people telling Miles what to do because they don't think he's capable of making his own decisions. And this results in him, of course, rebelling against that, doing it anyway, and proving to people that he was capable. My problem with this is that it was largely similar to Into the Spider-Verse, in my opinion, where once again Miles isn't seen as good enough to join a team who try to tell him what to do, but then he believes in himself and he proves them wrong. It's not exactly the same, but it definitely felt noticeably familiar when I was watching it. Like, that was kind of constantly in the back of my mind, was this feels very similar to what Miles went through already in the first film. And there's also no real, like, conflict or decision for Miles to make either. He's told his dad it has to die because it's a canon event, but he immediately says that ain't happening, as most people would do, and decides he's gonna run. It's a pretty no-brainer choice for him to make, so there's not much internal conflict going on either. And real quick, while we're on the subject, canon events as a whole were like super messy and raise just a ton of narrative questions that, I don't know, asked me to suspend my disbelief just a little too much. I mean, there are thousands of Spider-Men in the Spider Society that's shown, and canon events are described as events that all Spider-Men must go through.
Chapters that are a part of every Spider story, every time.
But there's inconsistencies there. For example, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is shown to be part of this multiverse canon, but he never experienced the death of the Captain, which is a pivotal canon event in the film. It's the main one being focused on. And given the vast amount of Spider people on show, it's really hard to believe these canon events happen to all of them, which sounds nitpicky, I know, and it wouldn't matter too much if not for the fact the entire reason that 2099-6, just the entire Spider Society on Miles, is because Miles wants to stop his dad from dying. And I don't know, you think someone so obsessed with keeping canon events in line like Miguel would have figured out that some of these Spider-Men just don't have certain canon events. And it's also like just a little kind of unbelievable to think that no Spider-Man in Spider Society has pointed this out to him either. But you can fill in the blanks here and assume that maybe Miguel just somehow knows that this is a canon event for Miles. Even though technically he shouldn't really even have them since he was never meant to be Spider-Man in his universe. And I feel like that's probably where part 2 is going with it. But it does feel to me like Miguel should have figured this out already, given the authority figure that the film paints him as. Anyway, this still doesn't really excuse what is, in my opinion, the biggest eyebrow raise in the movie, and something I've seen pointed out a ton, so I know I'm not alone in this one at least, but of all these Spider-Men, not a single one of them has objected to just letting innocents, usually ones close to them, die. No questions asked before. They just all stand there and unquestionably do whatever 2099 tells them to. He's like, make sure this kid's dad dies, and they're all like, yeah, sure, okay, buddy. You have this entire society comprised of variants of a hero that famously has a no-kill rule, and yet no one has mentioned how messed up this is until Miles.
What's important is not standing by and allowing someone to suffer or die because you do nothing. If you don't get that, then you don't get the first thing about being Spider-Man.
When you display as many Spider people as you do in that chase scene, that becomes just a little too weird from a narrative standpoint, in my opinion. I'm sure there are Spider-Men who kill across the multiverse, but the majority of them tend to not. TMNT, on the other hand, tackles a core theme of the franchise that I think often gets neglected. There's always a lot of heavy emphasis on them being ninjas in other adaptations, and that makes sense. They are ninjas after all. The mutant turtle bit is also usually pretty well covered, but teenage really is, and we see a lot of that in this movie. Each of the 4 turtles are characterized just to perfection here. I adored every single one of them, and despite being the same characters you know and love, changes were made to their core personalities that I think makes them more relatable and more lovable than ever. See, Leo is still the leader, but he's not as fearless and stubborn as he usually is. He's at an earlier point in his life, and instead he comes across as the responsible older sibling that's constantly struggling between doing as he's told and giving into his natural teenage urges, like wanting to have fun with his brothers and, getting kind of horny for April. Raph still has his anger issues, but they're framed in a less exhausting light than usual. He's not constantly flipping out at Leo and becoming annoyingly hot-headed and making stupid mistakes. Instead, he's more of a bored brute who just wants to let loose and enjoy his life a bit, but his situation stops him from doing that, and it frustrates him. And Donnie's still the nerd, but now he's less of a 90s, PC basement dweller, and instead this kind of awkward yet charming younger brother with this fanboyish attitude towards pop culture. And Mikey, most impressively to me, is just no longer, loud and obnoxious skater dude with an annoying voice. He's just this insanely chill dude who likes to have fun and is appropriately less violence orientated than the rest of them. And they absolutely nail how well these characters behave. They are such teenagers in all the worst and most endearing ways. They're stupid, they're ignorant, they're awkward, and they are obsessed with pop culture. I mean, seriously, they spout out references every 5 minutes. But it's done in such an endearing and so painfully teenage way that I didn't mind. I couldn't help but be reminded of myself at their age. But on the flip side, they're also struggling to figure out who they are. They want lives outside their house and their family, and they want to be popular and fit in with others. And I think these are things that most people can relate to, especially when they were teenagers. And that really is the film's central theme, the desire to be accepted as you are and not be judged because you might be different from the status quo. And the film just does a fantastic job of keeping this persistent throughout. From the way the turtles are in constant awe of human culture to their whole motive for stopping the villain being an attempt at gaining popularity so people will accept them. How this theme even persists through the villain, Superfly, who wants exactly the same thing, only he has a far more violent way of going about it: human genocide and a mutant revolution. It's a great conflict. 2 groups facing the same problems with the same goal, but vastly different ideals, and the ultimate conclusion reached by Leo that this should have never been their reason for wanting to do the right thing in the first place. A conclusion that highlights that the Turtles should have in fact been focusing on who they are, not what they're perceived as. And they are, in fact, good people who do the right thing. There's also the fact that Superfly completely loses who he is in his quest for acceptance, quite literally changing into something unrecognizable. And I think that's a big reminder that you should never give yourself up in an attempt to feel accepted by those around you. It's funny, if 4 months ago you had asked me, Spider-Man Obsessive Extraordinaire, which animated movie did I think would be the most moving this summer, TMNT would not have been the winner, and yet here we are. This film not only provoked nostalgia for my teenage years, but it actually made me nostalgic for New York culture, which is something I've never even experienced. They paint it in such like an oddly beautiful light that I found myself yearning for it right alongside the Turtles, and that's just great storytelling. These little dudes just love each other so much, and watching them fight together, play together, and even almost die together was just so incredibly heartfelt. Spider-Verse certainly had its moments, and, you know, comparing the two is a bit like comparing a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. They're both fantastic films, but it was far more spectacle focused, and that's not a bad thing, it's just not what I personally value more in movies. Spider-Verse impressed me with its fantastic visuals and insane animation, but the Turtles stole my heart this time around.